Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Terry Hildebrandt at the Fielding Graduate University. I'm the director of the Evidence-Based Coaching Program, and we're excited today to have a panel talking about coaching and inclusion and diversity. We have an esteemed panel of guests that are going to be sharing their experiences on how coaching can really make a difference to drive inclusion and diversity in all kinds of organizations. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel. We have Thomas Leal, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Fielding Graduate University, Christopher D. Hicks, who is an alum of Fielding, and also a Building Inclusion Collaborative Fellow at the Fielding Graduate University. And we have Shirley Engelmeyer, the Founder, CEO, and Chief Inclusion Strategist of Inclusion, Inc. So they're all going to be working for us today and answering some questions and how they bring inclusion and diversity in the world of coaching together. So I'm going to start us out with a question. So if each of the panelists could tell us about your journey of incorporating coaching into your work to create more inclusive organizations.
Mm-hmm. I can start, Terry, or go ahead. You call on us, Terry, so we don't speak over each other.
Okay, since you volunteered, Shirley, why don't you start?
You know, about 5 years ago, we were launching a new body of work. It was called the Inclusive Leader. We had validated inclusion competencies globally with Southern Methodist University's Executive Education Department, and we were now validating these inclusive leader competencies and putting them into a 360 format. It was for the executive level, and as most executives go, they're super bright. They want to, from a political perspective, never show their vulnerabilities. And so we found that the most effective way to work with the 360 was to have one-on-one, completely confidential executive coaching. And that was a critical piece to a 3-month journey on them building their inclusive leader competencies, looking at their biases, and it wound up being a critical piece for us. So thanks, Terry.
Great, thanks, Shirley. So Tomas, if you mind saying a little bit about your journey.
Sure. So my journey in D&I generally has been a very personal one, a journey of great personal learning and growth. Continued to be the case with the new job, the job at Fielding. So using my experiences, my personal story as sort of an instrument for coaching in some ways has been important for me. So through my experiences, my story, I believe I've been a useful and an effective coach in my work to create an inclusive work environment, inclusive organizations rather. For the past 24 years before Fielding, I worked in the corporate space in mostly diversity, inclusion, change management positions. So working with leaders and employees at all levels around diversity and inclusion. As we know, diversity and inclusion is an organizational change strategy, right? So providing the opportunity for coaching, providing me the opportunity for coaching on inclusive behaviors and practices. I'm familiar with SMU, Shirley, because I'm part of the Latino Career Development Program with Dr. Mickey Quinones, right? So really enjoy that whole organization as one that is sort of cutting edge around inclusive leadership. So my journey has been coaching leaders at all levels, members of diversity and inclusion councils. In the corporate setting, we have employee affinity groups, right, that I've coached, and leadership teams. So that's kind of a quick sort of review of my journey. I am sort of coming full circle because I started my career right after grad school in higher education, moved into the corporate private sector, and now I'm back in higher ed. So that's kind of a quick view of my D&I journey.
Great, thanks, Tomas.
Mm-hmm.
Chris.
Yes, and I'm new to this, especially compared to Tomas and Shirley. I think combined, their experience is greater than the amount of years I have on the earth. Shirley said something about vulnerability, and I think that was it for me. My background is in the military, and I was really good at that kind of command and control type of leadership. But when I left the military, I realized that I needed to evolve. That's what led me into coaching. The D&I space, this is actually materializing in front of me. As you mentioned before, I am a BIC fellow, and that has afforded me the opportunity to have some really good engagements in the D&I space. But getting back to the vulnerability part, I think that is one of the areas where my research is taking me, you know, especially as far as like occupational stress, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as coaching goes, some of my earliest coaching experiences, I've only been coaching since 2015, have been with veterans who are coming back from service back into the civilian world. And it's a great thing to be able to share my experience. And it's a great thing to have them see some of the positive results that I've had, whether they're just coming back into the world as a worker or they're taking a leadership role. There is a considerable shift from being a Marine or an Army Ranger or what have you, and to kind of being vulnerable, but it's definitely worth the challenge.
Great, thank you all. So our next question is, how do you distinguish between diversity and inclusion, and how are these concepts similar and different? Let's start with Chris.
Well, I think that when we came up with the concept of diversity, it was originally intended to be the same as inclusion. But we're all at different places, and you know, we start where we're at, and so diversity has kind of evolved into inclusion. I hope that we are witnessing an evolution. To me, the distinction that I would make is that diversity is everywhere, but inclusion is a lot rare. It's a lot more rare, and it takes work, especially on the side of assessment. It takes commitment, and I think that most people have warmed up to the idea of diversity, but putting it into action as far as inclusion is concerned, I think that takes effort, takes commitment, and ultimately it takes guidance. And I think that coaching plays a very key role in making that happen.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, if I may add, I would agree with Chris that diversity was basically all we were talking about when I first started this journey, right? My D&I journey. But basically, diversity is you know, all the ways, you know, that we're similar, that we're different, right? And so that there are visible differences like skin color, gender, age, some others, and then there are invisible differences like our educational background, culture, and family status. I think historically in organizations, we've really focused on race, ethnicity, and gender, those that were visible, and not so much on the others. And I think as we evolved into this space called diversity, we started evolving into these other dimensions that weren't visible, but just as important, right, that really drive who we are. Inclusion is in my view, how do we leverage those differences? Because having diversity by itself without the inclusion is not really doing much other than having diversity in an organization. Inclusion to me is leveraging those differences. Andres Tapia, who's a researcher at Korn Ferry, and I'm paraphrasing his line, but he says, diversity is the mix, inclusion is making the mix work. So that's how I would see diversity and inclusion. But agree with Chris that initially we were just talking about diversity and stopping the conversation there, and eventually inclusion started coming into that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for me, needless to say, with a company called Inclusion Inc., that's 18 years old, we've been working to help organizations understand what they have to do, because diversity is who we are. Okay, it's just who we are. Does it mean I can get more education? Sure, but essentially it's all those dimensions that we know still largely showing up and not making the progress we need to on a representation metric perspective. Inclusion, we loosely call a verb. I'm aware I'm in academia and that it truly is not a verb, but you have to do something to include someone. And you can see whether I'm being inclusive or not by the behaviors I demonstrate, by how I interact with you. So way back in 1996, I found something when I was moving materials around in my office. We had this title of a course, Diversity plus Inclusion equals Business Success. For us, if we don't get the C-suite, the executives who are still predominantly white men, for women, we've just broken through to it's either 6.2 or 6.6 of Fortune 500 CEOs. People of color are still below the 5% mark. We have to speak a language that makes sense to executives, that says our tagline is inclusion's a business strategy. That's why we need to do it, because what we do is going to harness the greatest innovation. We're going to keep the best talent in one of the lowest unemployments in the century, and we're going to have a more engaged workforce.
Great. Thanks, Shirley.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. All right. So what do you see as the biggest challenges around diversity and inclusion today that leaders and organizations face? And Shirley, I know you started talking about this already, so I'm going to start with you to maybe continue to see, what are you seeing as some of the biggest challenges?
I see one of the challenges being differentiating what diversity means. And for most corporate clients we work with, it really means representation metrics. It's a chart that shows how we've attracted and whether we've retained women or people of color. People like that. In fact, awards are given out, for the top 50 in diversity. And yet, how do you measure inclusion? And so part of the complexity at corporate is to lift up a construct of how do you behavioralize inclusion? How do you behavioralize and create a skill set using different language than that for inclusive leader? And Tomas, by the way, Miguel Canones is the one we worked with on our Global Inclusion Index out of SMU in like 2011 or 2012. And I would say that the big elephant in the room is lack of accountability.
Yep.
I have really never seen, I remain hopeful 93% of the time. The 7% is really ugly because it says, are we ever going to break through that says the reason you need diverse talent isn't because you're being nice to people of color or women or gays or lesbians or the whole list of things we can do. It's because you might sell more goods and services. You might do a more effective job in terms of what you're doing. And yet I still find, and I think it's more on the historical origin of how diversity work was done, that it unintentionally excluded white men and it never was linked to business. So I think education and accountability are what I would say are the hardest places. I'll pause there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Chris, I'd love to hear your perspective on what do you see as some of the biggest challenges, and you might just say a little bit about BIC since most of our viewers may not be familiar. and maybe what you've learned from that experience as well.
Sure. I mean, Shirley pretty much said it all. It comes down to this accountability and responsibility, and you're constantly trying to find some type of harmony or balance between the two of them. It's easy to point the finger at someone else. It's also easy to put someone in a position and say, hey, well, Tomas, now, you're in charge of diversity. But that's not going to do it. That's not going to do it. And so one of the efforts that I'm a part of with the BIC, with the Inclusion Council, is we're coming out with a directory, because at the end of the day, we need information, we need data. It's okay to not know, but it's not acceptable to not have anywhere to look or even put that effort. So the Building and Inclusion Council, we are developing kind of a very broad directory of resources that organizations, individuals, and I'll be honest, it's mostly tailored to higher education. But because it's research-based, it's going to have a lot of utility across the board in the corporate world and nonprofit, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Definitely. It's a. You're right, Chris. It's a resource guide, and initially it was focused on faculty, but I think it has a broader use as I see the different resources, the initial draft of the resource guide. I'm agreeing with both Chris and Shirley. There's research that points to the fact that in order for diversity and inclusion, any diversity and inclusion effort to be sustainable, to be effective, to kind of stick to the organization, you do need commitment and accountability from senior leaders. Now, whether it be senior leaders in corporate, in the nonprofit, or in higher education, right? You need that commitment. And senior leaders for us at Fielding is not only university leaders, but also academic leaders, right? To really drive this effort and really embed it, right, into the university or embed it into any organization that you're working with. That said, my experience is that many leaders struggle with accountability because accountability translates to behaviors and walking the talk. And here's where I think coaching comes into it as well. Because oftentimes I get leaders saying, well, I want to be inclusive. I want this to work. I just don't know how, right? And so it's really, that's the important conversation to have. The other piece that's a challenge for me that I've seen, not just for me, but I've seen, is organizational culture, right? Also plays a role in the diversity and inclusion process. So the level of organizational readiness, right, or lack thereof, can oftentimes create challenges for leaders. And so the critical question is really, how do leaders show up in this space, and what does she or he need to do to create that environment that is receptive and willing to engage in diversity and inclusion? And to me, those are the accountability as well as organizational culture are the ones that create some of the challenges in this space.
Great, thank you. So Thomas, I think your comments are leading us to this next question, which is, what do you see as the primary role of a coach in driving inclusion and diversity? And I'm going to start with you, Thomas, since you referenced coaching, just to kick this off.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the role is to really, again, as I said before, to help people in organizations that want to drive inclusion and diversity, but not only want to, but also to have the conversation about the business case or the case for action, as Shirley mentioned, and really clearly, one of the things that I've discovered in the years that I've done this work, like, we can put together a pretty robust business case or a pretty robust case for action. But I think what works, again, is when leaders themselves come up with that business case, when leaders themselves are coached in a way or guided into that conversation and guided into a conclusion that says, we need to do this. And I think it's two things. I think it's the right thing to do, but I also think it's good for the organization. whether it be corporate, whether it be a nonprofit again, or a university. So I think that's part of the role of coaching. Behaviors that the organization can touch and feel is important, that show that the leader is accountable for D&I. So how do I show as a leader, the university, the organization, my company, that I am a champion, that I believe in this, and these are the things very specifically that I'm doing, and that can come through this coaching process where again, I believe that people need to come to this through their own knowledge and through their own sort of energy and passion. And then this process then must translate into action plans, right? In order to create effective development for the individual to become an inclusive leader. So what do I need to do? What actions do I need to take in order to start learning how to be more inclusive? So, I mean, to me, that's kind of, so I feel like I'm rambling, but it's kind of how I see this whole coaching piece as it relates to the work that I'm doing.
Great, thanks, Thomas. So Shirley, I know you've done a lot of coaching around inclusive leader. Could you share a little bit of how you see coaching playing an important role in this space?
Yeah, so again, the way that we use coaching is as one of three pieces at the executive level. We use coaching for handling the one-on-one feedback, the one-on-one digestion, the one-on-one handling difficult conversations part of this. That happens in our process after this 360 is done, and it not only does a comparison against these 12 inclusive leader competencies that are behavioralized, but it also tells you if men and women gave you different scores, if white people and people of color gave you different scores, if different age groups. And then the final piece of this, and it happens like over a 90 to 120 day phase, is the cohort learning. Here's the part I want to lift up that helps get really handled in the coaching and then also manifests in the learning cohort. At the beginning of this, I find execs to be super antsy. Like, we know all this. We know the business case. I know this. I could teach this. Why are you telling us this? To by the time the 90 or 120 days are over, they're going, I can't believe how hard creating a culture of inclusion is. Mm-hmm. So we have spent so much time on diversity and looking at representation metrics, and it hasn't yielded us the results that we had hoped for in terms of really breaking through. I think the piece that coaching does, and I go back, and Chris, thanks for honing in on that vulnerability. The other piece I might add to this is that coaching adds real intentionality to lifting up for someone something they may not want to hear and certainly don't want to discuss in their cohort, but it's so blatant from the report or the work that they actually have to look at it.
So the power of feedback and giving people clear metrics of how they're doing is really critical, I think.
Yeah.
And just
go ahead, Terry.
I'll just make one comment, Tomas, and then throw it to you. And Terry, you're actually so extremely effective in this, in just very matter-of-factly lifting up something that someone may take really hard, but doing it in a matter-of-fact way, and how are we going to work on it, which I love about coaching, rather than, oh my God, Shirley, did you see what you scored on that? So there's really a way to work at that level. To you, Tomas.
No, I was kind of sort of piggybacking on that comment, that it's a matter of, it's hard. I mean, as a Latino myself, when I make this statement, I'm saying, okay, are you crazy? It's really taking some of the emotion out of it in a way that creates that constructive, difficult conversation. I think the resistance is an important part of any change process, right? If there isn't resistance, then the change is not in my view, not being effective. So I agree that it's again the vulnerability, the passion, but then also the more matter of fact almost way of really talking about these issues and really creating that intentionality. I like that word a lot. You know, you can't just, things don't happen organically in this space. You need to have some degree of intentionality around creating inclusive cultures. And so I agree. It's a good point. Yeah, great, thank you.
So Chris, I'd love you to chime in here on the role of coaching. You're a professionally trained coach like I am from our fielding, and you've worked in this space. What have you seen is helpful in bringing coaching into the mix?
So it's difficult following Tomas and Shirley, but if I just look at the role of a coach for a second, I think that creating a safe environment is critical. People want to, back to the theme of vulnerability, we've been talking about it all night. People want to open up. People want to say, this is where I'm at, accept me as this. And I think that the role of the coach is to create that safe space where people can actually do that. And I feel like that's where the work of coaching occurs. I feel like that's what it is. People have to feel safe. They have to trust you. If we kind of go back to something that Tomas mentioned earlier about cultural change, I think that's at the heart of D&I work, you know, and if we're truly committed to changing the culture in an organization, then my theory is that coaching skills, coaching would be the mode of communication. Like that's the language of cultural change.
Great, thank you. I would completely agree with you. The importance of trust and vulnerability. You know, if the leader can't really be honest with themselves and the coach, you're kind of a non-starter. So really great points. We've had a couple of questions here from the audience, and I'd like to defer to a couple of them at this point. And I have one more major question for the panel later, but if it's okay, let's go to the audience for a second. And Gretchen had a question. Gretchen, would you like to share your question, or would you rather me read it? If you're interested in asking it, you can just turn on your microphone and go ahead and begin. Okay, I'm going to read her question on her behalf at this point. So
I think she might have left.
Oh, she may have. Okay.
Yeah.
So her question was, do you find that engagement metrics are one way of tracking effective inclusion behaviors and culture, and might effective inclusion be tracked through cultural change metrics? So that was a question about metrics.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, I mean, you do track some. So the tracking of engagement survey, my sense is that you need to have specific questions that are geared at inclusion. So it's always good to have sort of that inclusion sort of fact in there, or that inclusion, 2 or 3, 4, 5 questions that give you that index, right? An inclusion index in any survey, engagement survey. That said, there are also, anecdotal ways to get, measure success of any inclusion or inclusion effort in an organization. Again, those are there's good news, bad news with these kinds of surveys as well, because especially in a global organization, a question in the US and in the Western world might be a different, or fall differently, or have a different perspective from someone in the East or in Latin America or in Africa or in India. So I think that's the other part of engagement surveys that can be an issue if you're in a global organization.
Good point. Shirley, I think you were going to say something about metrics.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about metrics. I think engagement surveys have attempted to create inclusion indexes and haven't been that effective.
Right.
And part of what you said, Tomas, was there aren't very many questions that are related to inclusion behaviors. And you'll hear me repeat like a mantra, how are you going to look at what behaviors are you using, are being used towards you? Which inclusive leader competencies or skills are you using and being used for you? The other factor that, we've been doing, since probably for 20 years before I formed Inclusion Inc., customized web-based and primarily inclusion and diversity, like culture audits, for lack of a better word. Yes, let's get a pulse on where things are. The biggest comparison point that we have tried to get to is the differential between demographics. Because if you look at an organization and you say, 92% of the people here feel that they're included or their voice is heard, you might be patting yourself on the back. If you start to break that out and you say, well, what is it for white people? What is it for men? What is it for people of color? What is it for millennials? And break that further with the confidentiality threshold. The other thing that we found in this work is you need to even, assuming that you're not going to know that it's Shirley from Golden Valley who's a baby boomer, okay? Assuming all of that part's handled, there are certain places that we find women are fine until they get to this place, and then their voice is at, 42% of being heard, where overall that same thing might have been at 92%. So that engagement, in answer to the question, from my perspective, they give a broad brush without doing the demographic deep dive to see where it is. They don't have enough questions. We also, because we validated these inclusive leader competencies, love this idea of other people telling us, are we demonstrating these behaviors or not? And the final place, which I'll just give the super short Reader's Digest on here, is the inclusion scorecard, where we look at policies and practices and create a 3-tier rating on each of those with a client to say, you don't change this policy or this practice, you're never going to get to the change that you need someplace else. So thank you.
Okay. Chris, any thoughts on metrics that you might want to add?
Yeah, just to kind of dramatize or add a little texture to what Shirley was just saying, as a 40-year-old Black man, don't engage me and get my hopes up, and then that's it. Like engagement metrics, that's not D&I. That's you're supposed to be you're collecting data at that point, or you're tracking progress. In my experience, in my personal experience, that's been the bulk of D&I work, or what an organization would kind of put a check in the box for. We took a survey, we asked questions, and so that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, to build up that kind of anticipation, to kind of say, all right, well, there's hope for this work environment, there's hope for this organization, and then it's just like, well, we did that, and now it's back to business. And that's what I hear Shirley saying throughout her experience. It's there's got to be more than just engagement. We can't keep confusing engagement with the actual work of D&I.
Yeah, excellent point. So we have another question from Lisa. Lisa, would you like to come online and ask your question? And this is great, thank you.
So particularly in the STEM fields, there's the emphasis on technical skills and creating the products and marketing. And how can one approach presenting the ideal of valuing the needs of diverse communities when they're developing the resources and developing the products? And it's kind of a two-part question, but I'll start with.
Okay.
Can you repeat that, Terry? I had a little trouble. It broke up a little bit for me.
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind saying it one more time, Lisa, what was your first part?
Yeah, so particularly in the STEM fields with the emphasis in technical skills, how can one approach the ideal of valuing the needs of diverse communities when they're developing resources?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this answers your question. I mean, my job where I worked before fielding, I was at a big pharmaceutical company, and I specifically supported scientists, the R&D community globally at this company. And one of the conversations that it was important to have, I mean, the whole basis for research, right, in this field is diversity. Right? You don't go with one way of creating medications and think that that's going to work for everybody, right? So one of the ways that diversity was embedded into the R&D culture in this pharma company was through the realization that the clinical trials that they did, when they got to the point of clinical trials, they needed to be done with diverse communities because, as we know, different ethnic groups, different races have different reactions to the medications that we're trying to produce. So if a hypertension medication works in a white community, it may not work in a Black community, or vice versa. So I think that through always finding a way to sort of embed and really create that opportunity to have that conversation about diversity and inclusion specifically with the way that they're doing business, with the products, with what the results that they're trying to get to. I mean, it's kind of at the very essence of the business case, but it's also at the very essence of how they need to think of themselves as scientists or as technical people, but also how they're engaging with those, that diversity of thought, the diversity of perspective, and how we include that diversity is really what creates a better product at the bottom line, not just in the STEM technical field, any of the companies, any of the other sort of industries that I've worked in. Yeah. Yes, my reaction to that STEM technical question. Thanks, Lisa. That's a good question.
Terry, I have a thought here. Lisa, I think that we're never going to meet the needs of diverse communities if we don't have people within the organization that are at a leadership and decision-making level that are diverse. So STEM is a highly sophisticated field. Let me take my consumer products example when my last corporate assignment was at Frito-Lay. The fastest growing populations for sale of snack foods were Latinos first and African Americans. Who were the brand managers? They were mostly white people. So, you know, don't ask me, white woman from Minnesota, how to sell chips in that flavor. And even if I've had people say, well, what about focus groups? What about focus groups? And in something as sophisticated as STEM, you know, I have a very contrary idea to what people say in that you can become culturally competent. I say I can never become culturally competent on someone else's culture, really. I can learn some key components, but I will never represent either of those population groups, whether it's for needs of STEM and diverse communities, or if it's the sale of chips. And that kind of input has to happen way, way back. Look at all the mistakes that have been made in advertising in the last 18 months or 2 years with the heightened sensitivity. Who were they at the ad agencies? They weren't the people from the communities who would have noticed those things happening way back. So, man, I wish we were making better progress on that.
Anything you'd like to add, Chris?
Yeah. I've learned to try to keep things really, really simple. And outside of work, if I wanted to hang out with Tomas, he would either have to invite me or I would have to invite myself. And I think we need to keep that in mind. You know, we're trying to make things very complicated. It's just, if I were to call Ken Johnson from East Coast Executives, he has a diverse staffing firm, and I would have asked him, you know, how many organizations in the STEM field are reaching out to you? How often do you get a phone call? Maybe once a year, once a week? You know, because there's obviously we have the demand, as Shirley was saying, the demand is there. Who's reaching out to these organizations that have put themselves out there as, hey, if you want women in STEM, this is what my organization does. You know, how do I engage with you? How do you engage with me? You know, how do we develop a relationship? And that's why I say it's simple. If you continue to work within your organization, you're going to keep getting the same ideas. We've got to become more comfortable with reaching out, and then having ways of finding people that are experts in what you're looking for. So that's what I have to add to that.
Yeah.
Well said.
Right.
So, Lisa, did we get a good start to answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Yes.
Great. So we have another question from Michael about internal versus external. Michael, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the panel for taking time out of your schedules to be here today. I surely appreciate that. But we're talking about coaching in regards to fostering more of a diversity and inclusion environment or culture. Have you had any experience or any thoughts in regards to external coaches versus internal coaches that could give an organization more of a benefit in either looking more towards externals or utilizing internals effectively?
Can I start that, Terry?
Absolutely.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, you're asking when you're doing the coaching of executives or whatever, whether you use people from a firm or internal. When we do our work, we suggest bringing our coaches, our external coaches in, because we can say things to executives that maybe an internal person can't say, lift up this bias they may have, this huge gap that they found. Sure, we applaud their strength and where they're doing well, but we don't have any career risk associated with it. No one's going to say, wow, can you believe what Shirley just told me? You know, let's get her off the hypo list. It may not be that blatant, but, you know, that high potential. When I was in corporate, I was very careful who I really told what I thought. And so it depends. If you're trying to do the extraordinarily difficult work of a coaching approach day in and day out, I think that can be highly effective internally, as long as you can get somebody else to help you, you know, turn the ship in a sense in the direction that you're not always the outlier voice.
Yeah, I would agree with that, particularly if we're talking about coaching in the diversity and inclusion space, which tends to be more difficult, right? More having to have those difficult conversations with leaders and with executives. Having been in organizations where we use both internal and external, I think in the D&I space, the externals were more effective. And a caveat to that is it also depends on the organizational culture, right? And some cultures are more, and not even just the organizational culture, but the department culture, the leader. I mean, I worked with a very senior leader in Big Oil who was a huge champion and was willing to have those difficult conversations and would rather have those vulnerable conversations with someone internally than externally. So it just depends. But generally speaking, I would say in the D&I space, the external coaches have been, in my view, more effective in D&I, in diversity and inclusion. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I'd be curious when an organization is given the option between external and internal. I would like to hear what their plan for internal would be. Are you turning over your top producers? Are we looking to develop coaching skills for them? Is this all your middle managers? Who is going through, who is going to experience this coaching? I would be excited to see an organization that's saying that, the majority of our middle managers or our leadership, we want them to receive coaching, or we want them to act as coaches within the organization. But as Tomas and Shirley are saying, the external coaches, they can do things that the internal people cannot. And I guess it's just, especially when you're talking about leaders, you're talking about people that have put a lot of effort into their position. They're making a lot of money, naturally, just to survive, it'd be very difficult to open up to someone who might add on to your 360, or have any say in your career. It's just that natural distrust. But the external coach can kind of, like I said before, create that safe space.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, this is probably a good time for me to ask my other question, which is, what impact have you seen that coaching can have on inclusive behaviors in executives and leaders?
I could start. I mean, the piece, and we've kind of touched on this already, is really that self-awareness as a first important step, right, in terms of creating or becoming that inclusive leader. Self-awareness and self-understanding, and also, and again, I said before, a leader or a manager who wants to champion diversity but doesn't know how, I think through coaching, the leader can map out for them, what is it not map out for them, but they can map out for themselves, actually. What is it they need to learn, right? And help them with that, providing guidance that way. I think also coaching, when I've seen coaching and diversity and inclusion be most impactful is when leaders in that space of vulnerability are willing to acknowledge their own biases and create opportunities for them to sort of, mitigate these biases in a way. I don't think we can get rid of bias. I'm always humored by, we're eliminating biases, unconscious biases sort of become a buzzword. I'm thinking that the self-awareness of biases is more about debiasing a system. Shirley mentioned organizational systems that need to be debiased in terms of how policies and procedures may, sort of include certain communities and exclude others. So that is all part of the process. I think coaching can help leaders identify and account for those biases, and really create that awareness. To me, another piece of it, and it's been mentioned a few times, is again, not only vulnerability. I would agree with Shirley. To me, it's not cultural competence as much as the cultural humility to really hear those different other realities that are in your system, that are on your team, that are in your university, and really not make them not as worthy, but really accept them as another reality and not my own. And I think that, to me, is what an inclusive leader, when I see a really inclusive leader or executive, is one that is willing to have that conversation and really share the space with other realities, other people's experiences. I'll say one more thing. Harvard Business Review did a study on, I think the headline was "Why Diversity Programs Aren't Working." That caught my interest. So basically, bottom line, what changes culture? Programs and lunch and learns and bring your favorite food to the office kind of things kind of create an environment, right? A tone, if I may. But according to the study, what really creates change is that one-on-one contact with difference, right? So how do we create opportunities for our leaders, for our community to be in community with each other and learn about each other? Chris's comment about, I'm going to either invite Tomas into my space or I'm going to invite myself. to me, that's what creates change, that one-on-one contact. And yeah, so, I mean, that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it boils down to relationship and respect. I say that because, you know, as Thomas was saying, it's that invitation. We're getting back to the vulnerability aspect of things. So for myself, I'm trained as a workplace psychologist. But the funny thing about it is that I know when this coaching is working with the client, when they're starting to report not just results in the workplace, but in their personal relationships, whether it be a marriage or just friendships or just connecting with neighbors. And, you know, for me, that's a key indicator that the coaching that we're doing is working, because it's not just limited to the workplace. I think that when you respect other people and you learn to be more aware of how you're engaging people, and you're using questions, you know, you're seeking to understand instead of being heard, or for you to be understood. I think that goes a long way, and that for me, in my experience, that's been carrying over, and I get excited. I can almost tell when a coach is about to say this, you know, because they'll usually preface it. This has nothing to do with work, but, you know, like I said, as someone who is trained in workplace psychology, you know, that's where my training is. That's what I understand. But I do feel some type of way when people start talking about their personal relationships and how this new way of communicating is helping them in that regard.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to the impact of coaching. And for me, it's hard to distinguish the coaching with the executives from the coaching in the cohort. I have found the combination of the two of those with this, you know, soak time with assignments in between to allow people to come to awarenesses or ahas that they couldn't come to any other way. I'll tell it through a story. It was an executive team, and we were in the end of the 120 days. They'd had their third coaching, and the assignment was to listen to Tim Wise. Well, most of you know Tim Wise is a white man whose parents, with great intention, put him to be the other in schools as he grew up. And he talks about white privilege with the really in-your-face tone. And the first 3 or 4 people that I said, well, you know, tell me what you thought about, and this is a piece that he'd done at Google. Tell me what you thought about that. Oh, I don't like the tone of his voice. Well, oh, you know, grumpy. Chief Operating Officer said, I'm doing a 180 on you. And this still gives me goosebumps. It's the first time I got Black Lives Matter. That to me is profound change work. In my time of doing this for 25 years, hasn't happened. Does everybody get to that point? No. But people are started on their journey there. And sometimes, you know, for some of this work we've done, I've, for example, had conversations with Terry, wouldn't it be great if we could coach them for 10 or 15 times instead of 3 times? Because imagine where they could go at that point.
Absolutely. Thanks for the story. So we've got about 2 minutes left. I'd like to just have each of our panelists share some closing remarks, and mainly about, you know, some of our listeners may be aspiring coaches interested in bringing coaching into their own inclusive work. What advice might you have for them to get started in this space, just as a way to close?
I'll start. Obviously, you have a superb coaching program right there where this is going from. Get the certification because it's required. I had a very strong debate with a couple colleagues of mine who are superb trainers, and they couldn't understand why we weren't selling more training? And I said, because people don't want training, they want to be coached. So it's really a field that's opening and evolving, and there will be more and more need for it.
Thanks, Shirley. I think that's a good point, right? The difference between training and coaching and what people want in this century.
Yeah, I would say get to know people and their differences, whether it be in the coaching environment or whatever environment you find yourself in. Reject that single story about an entire culture. There's a great, I think it's a YouTube video or a TED Talk, I'm not sure, by Chimamanda Adichie, who talks about how our lives and our cultures are composed of many overlapping stories, not just that one story. And the one story sort of way that we view different cultures can be lead to misunderstanding. So I would say that, as well as, again, and it bears repeating, vulnerability, not only vulnerability to those you're coaching, but vulnerability yourself as a coach, and being open to learning. So that's what I would say.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I would just add that as a coach, and the coaches that I know, we see ourselves as providing a service. We're in service to our clients. So that's one thing to remember. Talk to coaches. Don't be afraid to reach out. We refer to each other. We know within our own networks who knows what, who's good at what, and it's not an industry where we're going to mislead you. If Terry or Tomas or Shirley know something that I don't know, I have no problem referring them. Referring a client. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Engage with coaches. I think you'd be pleasantly surprised at the amount of information and guidance that you can get.
Excellent. Yeah, Chris, that's an excellent segue to kind of my next topic. And first of all, I want to just thank all of our panelists today for bringing up some really important conversations. And this is an ongoing conversation that we have. And at Fielding, we have what's called the community of practice, which is designed to exactly do what Chris was talking about: network, share information, begin to build a community where coaches and others who are interested in coaching can continue to have dialogues like this on an ongoing basis. So if you haven't yet joined our coaching community of practice, it's open to anyone who believes in the power of coaching. You don't have to be officially part of Fielding to do that. You can join by going to ccop.fielding.edu. There's a short form, a survey that you can take, and then we will add you to our Basecamp community. So please consider joining. Again, that's ccop, which stands for Coaching Community of Practice.fielding.edu. We also have twice a month webinars. This webinar has been an evidence-based coaching community of practice webinar where we are talking about applying coaching to different topics in different industries. We have one next week also, which is called our Thought Leaders webinar, which is more bringing research. Fielding is one of the global leaders in coaching research in our PhD and EDD programs. And we'll have Dr. Millie McAdeen talking about the role of metacognition in executive coaching. She'll be sharing her dissertation research in this space. So we hope you can join us. If you can't make it live, we will record the session. And all of our programs are located on our main website. So if you go to coach.fielding.edu, you can download and watch all of these previously recorded videos by just either clicking on Professional Series Video or Thought Leaders videos. So we hope you can join us in the future. And again, thanks to all of our participants today who dialed in and your powerful questions. And we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar. And thanks again to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you, Terry.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks.
Good evening.